In December of 2018, my dad and I took a trip to Cuba. Before we departed for our trip, my dad half-jokingly said to me that where communism begins is where toilet paper ends, so we stocked up and were ready to head out. As is often the case, the reality of the situation ended up being more complicated, but also more optimistic than we initially expected. Cuba has many faces that left a strong impression on us throughout the week, one of them being its unique and incredibly rich history. Another is the socialist reality of the country, which was very familiar to my dad, who grew up in the Soviet Union. And finally, there are the newer developments that have been occurring rapidly in the past few years. Cuba has a lot of gorgeous colonial architecture built by the Spanish throughout almost 4 centuries. A few of the buildings are kept in pristine condition, but sadly, many of the others look completely destroyed. Cubans still look up to their national heroes, one of them being José Martí, the fighter for Cuban independence. Surprisingly, an incredibly popular historical figure for tourists and Cubans alike is writer Ernest Hemingway. Havana was one of his favorite places, and he spent a significant portion of his life there. Of course, the historical relics are not exclusive to Havana. We also visited the town Trinidad, which has remained almost in its entirety identical to the way it looked during colonial times. There were a lot of small museums to visit, though it should be said that the majority of them are just rich colonial houses that weren't destroyed during the Revolution and are now preserved and on display for visitors to enjoy. Other museums show traces of Cuba's good relationship with the Soviet Union. Another part of Havana's history is the Malecón, a broad esplanade and seawall. Centuries ago, pirates would dock here and try to invade Havana's fortresses. Nowadays, however, the Malecón has become a nice seaside location for tourists and locals to share. An interesting peculiarity of the Cuban history are the bright American cars from the 1950s. After the embargo on Cuba, these cars were renovated and remade for decades and are still in completely acceptable condition to this day. Many of these are often used as taxis and are a very popular way to get around the city. The second reality of Cuba is its incredibly well-preserved socialist regime. While it was a weird and unusual experience for me personally, it brought about many memories for my dad from living in the USSR in the 1980s. Officially, the country has 2 currencies. The usual Cuban peso, used by the Cuban people in non-tourist places, and the convertible peso, used predominantly by foreigners. Here's an example of how that system works. For the normal peso, the poorer citizens can buy the most basic and must-have items, such as groceries, appliances, etc. However, tourists and the fast-growing middle class get their supplies elsewhere, such as local markets and small government-owned stores. By the entrances to these shops, you can always find a line of people waiting to get in, and the selection inside is not particularly high. It's in places such as these where you can pay for supplies with the convertible peso. As is the case in most places, the quality of Cuban life strongly depends on the neighborhood. The older and central parts of Havana are very run down, but on the inside, everybody renovates their apartments in whatever way they can. The newer areas, again, are reminiscent of Soviet cities of the 1980s. The same brightly colored and restored cars we saw in tourist areas serve a far less fancy and more practical role for transportation here. Since all of their engines are very old, they create an exhaust that's very thick and makes it difficult to breathe, especially in central Havana. Of course, with cars as old as these, they become more difficult to repair and require constant maintenance. Despite the abundance of antique American cars, many cars are old Soviet models, such as Moskvich and Zhiguli. That said, even owning one of these is seen as a luxury, and most Cubans just travel by public transport. One of the differences my dad spotted between Cuba and the Soviet Union is Cuba's absence of socialist signs and slogans, at least in areas populated by tourists, but these increased greatly once we left central Havana. The Cuban people as a whole are very kind, friendly, and fairly relaxed. Due to the language barrier, it was hard to form any lasting friendships, but everywhere we went, everybody was very open and always ready to chat. Cubans love music and dance. It's a unique side to the culture, the traces of which we witnessed pretty much everywhere we went. Moving on, let's talk about the newer developments in the country that have come about in the past decade, few years, and even the past few months. After the fall of the Soviet Union and lack of support from their so-called Big Brother, Cuba had to open its doors to tourism, as it was the only sustainable industry that could be developed over a short period of time. Now tourism has become the main branch of the Cuban economy. It began solely as a governmental initiative, but is now becoming more and more privatized. The majority of tourists are far more interested in Cuba's colonial history as opposed to its rise to socialism. The exception to this, of course, being the Che Guevara merchandise sold everywhere, although I highly doubt that Che would have been pleased with the commercialization of his image. Tourists here get around in all kinds of ways, from carriage rides to bicycle taxis to the aforementioned fancy 1950s taxis. About 6 years ago, Cuba started to allow limited and controlled private businesses. Now, there are many private restaurants, the food in which can be more diverse and of better quality than in the government-owned ones. But even in government restaurants, waiters and musicians who make the most through tips are very active and very friendly. Many private apartments have been renovated and are now available for tourists to use through websites such as Airbnb. We stayed in a few of these places and were very pleased both with the quality of the apartments and the kindness and help offered by our hosts. Only a few years ago, Cuba's access to internet was still completely restricted. Even now, it's only slightly more accessible. In order to connect with the world, you need to be in a special Wi-Fi zone that are not always easy to come by, and have a special internet card that for about $1.50 gives you internet access for an hour. Like the USSR, Cuba remained an atheist country for many years. This only began to change in 1998 when Pope John Paul II came to Cuba and celebrated Mass in front of a giant crowd. Since then, Christmas has become a national holiday. On our last day, looking down at Havana from the country's highest point, the two of us shared some of our final thoughts and impressions on the trip. Cuba really is a country of huge potential, and it's an incredibly exciting time for it right now. Although my dad was right and the public bathrooms really almost never had any toilet paper, the face of the country is rapidly changing. Cuba has a long tradition of education and research in the scientific fields. It has birthed some great minds, and there is no reason why the newer generations cannot build a new society for themselves. The big question that remains is how long until these changes are successfully implemented. We decided that it would be interesting to go visit again in about a decade or so and see how the country has changed.